vampire, cannibal, necrophile, hypochondriac, schizophrenic. These are words commonly used to describe Richard Chase, aka the Vampire of San Francisco. In the late 1970s, he committed crimes that were so gruesome and disturbing, the FBI had to intervene. From drinking his victims' blood to disemboweling them and taking their organs, authorities had never seen anything like this before. And after this story, even the most thick-skinned true crime aficionado might need to take a breather, because this is unlike anything I've ever heard. Buckle up and put the top down, because it's time to let the fresh air in. Hello everyone, welcome back if you've been here before, and welcome if you're brand new. My name is Erin, and I'm fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. On Tuesdays, I like to explore a true crime case, and on Saturdays, I explore a cult or an extreme religion, and this often leads to more true crime. So if you're interested in these topics, please subscribe. I would absolutely love to have you here. And at the top of my videos, I like to recommend a book, and today's book, just like Saturday's book, is The Wife Before. Now, I'm recommending this book again because it is just that good. It's full of twists, full of surprises, and it's a great fit if you love true crime. It's all about a woman who's fallen in love with a man who has a very mysterious and dark history, especially as it pertains to his ex-wife. So, once again, highly recommend this book, and if you've read it, let me know what you think down below. Today's deep dive is a difficult one. While researching this case, I felt sick to my stomach multiple times. There will be several disturbing details, including depictions of animal abuse, gruesome acts of violence against both adults and children, and horrible details about what Richard would do after his victims were dead. Please take care of yourself and use discretion before watching any more. The McDonald Triad, also known as the Triad of Sociopathy, that was developed by J.M. McDonald in 1963. He said that if a child exhibited these three behaviors, bedwetting past the age of 5, an impulse to start fires, and cruelty towards animals, it was an indicator that the child was or could become a sociopath. We've seen this behavior in the likes of serial killers Jeffrey Dahmer, Israel Keyes, and countless others. And this observation has begged the question, why and what can be done sooner to prevent these children from growing up to become murderers? With mental health discussions becoming more and more normalized, one can only hope that in time we will find a solution that helps stop this disturbing behavior. Part of my fascination with true crime is exactly this, the psychology behind the behavior. Is it even possible to protect the general public from sociopaths? That we may never know. But what we can do is learn the symptoms and behaviors so that we can avoid these people and protect ourselves from them. So rather than sharing with you now all the gruesome details of Richard Trenton Chase's murders, let's start at the beginning and see if we can pinpoint how and why things escalated to such a barbaric degree. Richard was born on May 23, 1950. And side note, I'm a Gemini, and I absolutely hate when serial killers are Geminis, but just so everyone knows, we do not claim him. His parents were Beatrice Chase and Richard Chase Sr., and he has a little sister named Pamela. Initially, Richard seemed like a normal, average kid, and was even described as being a sweet child. He played Little League Baseball and was a Cub Scout, and seemed to be popular with other children. But although on the outside his family looked like the perfect nuclear family of the 50s, behind closed doors was a hidden life, where drinking alcohol in excess, children being beaten, and loud arguments were the norm. Richard's dad was an alcoholic and had trouble managing the family's money. He was a strict disciplinarian and frequently hit or screamed at Richard, even at the slightest mistake. There's even a story of when Richard was just 2 years old, his father force-fed him until he vomited. And this is the second story in like a week that we've seen a parent do this to a young kid, and I really don't understand why a parent would do that. It's kind of scary that it's come up multiple times in stories like this one. As for Richard's mother, Beatrice, she was constantly at odds with his father. She accused him of attempting to poison her and having multiple affairs. It seems the parents were both so distracted by their arguments with each other that they neglected to see the signs that began to emerge in their son. They weren't able to put together that he was exhibiting signs of the McDonald triad. By the time he was 10 years old, Richard discovered that he had an interest in animals, but not like other children who love animals and want to pet or cuddle them. Richard, on the other hand, wanted to see what their insides looked like. It began with cats. It seems to always begin with cats, doesn't it? Can you leave the cats alone? If he found a stray cat in the neighborhood, he would catch it and torture it before killing it and dissecting the poor helpless animal. He would then bury them in random areas. He even buried one in his mother's garden, and she would find it later. He killed so many cats in the neighborhood that multiple neighbors began complaining of the disappearances because some of them were their house cats. From cats, he moved to rabbits and birds and even dogs. I can't believe his parents were so preoccupied that they didn't notice any of this behavior. But sometimes I honestly wonder if people like Richard could even be helped in the first place. As Richard entered his teen years, his home life got even worse. His mother had been to different psychiatrists, and his father had mismanaged the finances so severely that the family lost their home and had to move to a different one. And Richard began living even further from reality. He found an interest in cooking, so much that he would burn pots and pans in the middle of the night and leave a mess in the kitchen. If he was alone, he would just hang out naked in the house, lighting matches and starting small fires. He even still wet the bed at 13 years old, and somehow it seems his parents never did anything to stop the behavior, but again, I'm not sure that he could have even been helped at this point. Between the troubles that both his parents seemed to have and the circumstances of his upbringing, coupled with his grotesque interests, it seemed that he was already well along his murderous path. When Richard got to high school, his parents finally separated. His mother took him and his sister to Los Angeles, but this angered Richard's father, who wanted his son back with him. So he took Richard back, and Beatrice and Pamela would return just a few months later. And Richard outwardly seemed to be coping with his troubling home life pretty well. He was popular at school, clean cut, and even had a couple of girlfriends. But soon, he would experience a very special kind of embarrassment. This embarrassment would cause both of his girlfriends to end up breaking up with him. Richard was impotent. He just couldn't seem to engage in certain acts with his girlfriends, and this would lead to them ending the relationship. Instead of trying to find a real, tangible, medical reason as to why he was challenged by this, he decided that it was simply because he didn't have enough blood. He was obsessed with finding a cure for his problem, and this obsession would lead him to a disgusting solution. He had to drink more blood. And how would he get the blood, you ask? He would go back to his childhood pastime. He would kill small animals and drink their blood. He also found another way to cope with his impotence. He became a frequent drug user. He experimented with LSD, amphetamines, and of course, marijuana. He was even arrested for possession of the Mary J. in 1965 at only 15 years old, and his father did little to help him get out of the situation. He refused to hire his son a lawyer, and he actually embraced the punishment the court had ordered upon Richard, which was really just some weekend community cleanup. Like, come on, Richard, it could have been much worse. But to Richard, this was a betrayal, and only caused Richard to resent him and his family even more. After years of drug use and inner turmoil, Richard finally, and somewhat surprisingly, graduated high school. He got a job as a typist, and it seemed like he was finally doing well. However, kind of embraced the aesthetic of a hippie, which was a symptom of the times. I mean, it was the 60s, so no one really batted an eye when he grew out his hair and his hygiene began to suffer. But Richard was still struggling. He was growing more and more frustrated by his impotence and sought out help from a psychiatrist. The psychiatrist recognized that Richard was probably mentally ill, but certainly not to the extent of murdering people and drinking their blood. The psychiatrist told him that the impotence could be due to anxiety and perhaps even a suppressed rage towards women. I'm just guessing that Richard didn't tell the doctor that he'd been drinking the blood of animals in his spare time. I just have a hunch. Richard would even move on to attend college. It seemed to his parents like he was actually getting his act together despite his outward appearance and troubling behavior. But unfortunately, once he left home, some of the most disturbing behaviors would emerge. Richard was now considered an adult. He was 18 and decided to leave home and live with roommates. The roommates, though, complained about his behavior, and he had a hard time staying in one place because of it. He even ended up having to move back in with his dad, but when his dad couldn't even handle Richard's behavior anymore, he kicked him out again and ended up paying for an apartment for him. Richard was constantly high or drunk and liked wandering around the house naked still. He was still obsessed and angry at his impotence, so much that he would kill rabbits, gut them, throw the guts inside a blender, and blend it with Coca-Cola. He would drink this disgusting cocktail with the hopes that he would cure his impotence, but since it never worked, he became more and more paranoid that something else was seriously wrong with him. He became a hypochondriac. And just like before, instead of seeking medical help, he decided he knew the cure. It was blood, obviously. The answer would always be blood. It was the lack of blood. So with this being his suspicion, he decided to take a rabbit's blood, and instead of drink it, he injected it directly into his bloodstream. Now, this actually caused him to get blood poisoning, and he was brought to the hospital, finally. And after seeing what he had done to himself, the doctors had him involuntarily admitted to Beverly Manor, a mental health institution. By now, he'd shaved his head because he'd become so paranoid that indeed something was wrong with his brain, and he wanted to, quote, track the movement of his cranial bones. I mean, at least he had some kind of insight that something wasn't quite right, but he also thought that his bones were turning into dust, so I'm not sure if we can really assess that he was self-aware, if you know what I mean. He was later diagnosed with severe schizophrenia, and I'd just like to mention here, as someone who has a family member with paranoid schizophrenia, this diagnosis does not mean you're a bad person or that you will end up a serial killer. I just want to make that abundantly clear. And that honestly goes for any mental health diagnosis. You did the right thing by getting diagnosed, and it in no way means that you are bad or not normal or wrong. It just means that you've taken steps to better understand yourself and to better yourself. And I just want to make it clear that Richard was evil and schizophrenic. He wasn't evil because he was schizophrenic. Plus, in Richard's case, the prescribed medication didn't seem to have an effect on him. So his condition was blamed on his recreational drug use, and he was then released into his mother's care. She gave him some time to get the medication out of his system and then moved him into an apartment with roommates. And guess what? The behavior continued. But this time, he added guns into the equation. He purchased several guns and kept killing animals. One time, his mother even witnessed him take a dead cat and smear its blood all over his face. I don't know what the correct thing to do in that situation is, but I don't think it's turn a blind eye, because just the next year, in 1977, when Richard was only 26 years old, he would take his first victim. On December 29th, 1977, 51-year-old Ambrose Griffin had just returned home from a shopping trip. He and his wife went to unpack their groceries. Mrs. Griffin grabbed a couple of bags and began walking into their home, and Mr. Griffin followed her with a bag of potatoes in his hands, when suddenly he collapsed behind her. She turned when she heard the fall, thinking that maybe he'd had a heart attack, but when she leaned down to check on him, she discovered the horrific truth. He had been shot by a drive-by by an unknown man. This man would later be proven to be Richard Chase. Just about 2 weeks later, on January 11th, 1978, Richard would meet Dawn Larson. She was his neighbor, and in the short time she'd lived there, she'd already begun to notice some odd behavior. For example, he frequently brought animals into his apartment, and then she would never see them again. And having animals were against the rules at the apartment complex. But she worried that he was just lonely and never said anything. On this particular day, he asked her if he could have a cigarette, and she obliged. But things got weird when he wouldn't let her leave until she gave him the entire pack of cigarettes. But luckily, he left her alone after that encounter, but it definitely left a mark on her. And it was only the beginning of a number of odd encounters with people in the community. It seemed he was testing the waters almost, seeing what he could get away with. Because just another 2 weeks later, Jean Layton witnessed him attempting to enter her home. Luckily for her, the doors and windows were locked, but then he went around to try the back door, and Jean saw him and made direct eye contact. I can't imagine how scared I would feel if this happened to me. I would probably just throw up from fear. It sounds so incredibly scary. But luckily, he just said some really nasty things to her, and with his dark, emotionless eyes, stared at her blankly. He was on his way. And this could have happened later in the same day or a few days later, but he actually made it into Robert and Barbara's home. They were coming home with groceries, and when they entered the house, they heard a noise. They'd spooked Richard, who had successfully broken into their house. Richard ran past Robert and ended up getting away. Luckily, inside the home, no one was hurt, but he had completely destroyed the inside of the home and urinated on a child's clothing and then defecated on a kid's bed. And it seemed from there that this scary behavior would only escalate. Richard had a habit of wandering through neighborhoods in broad daylight, checking for unsuspecting victims and unlocked doors. To him, an unlocked door was an invitation inside, so he would just walk on in. If a door was locked, on the other hand, he'd take that as a sign that he was not welcome. How about you take it as a sign that if you don't live there, you don't get to go inside someone's house? His next victim, however, would be 22-year-old Teresa Whalen, who was also pregnant. And mentally prepare if you're still watching, because this one gets really gruesome. She was simply taking the garbage out one day when she encountered Richard with a gun. He shot her 3 times before dragging her into the house and into her bedroom. After dragging her body into the house, Chase pulled her sweater up over her breasts and her pants down to her ankles. He violated her sexually and stabbed her in the chest, diaphragm, and breasts repeatedly, and even carved a nipple off of one of her breasts. He carved open her torso and pulled out her organs, including her kidneys and her pancreas, which he cut in 2 before placing her kidneys back inside her next to each other. Around her body were bloody circles, indicating that he had brought a bucket with him, presumably to steal some of her organs to take home with him. He had retrieved a small yogurt container from the trash bag she'd been carrying and began to drink her blood. Later, he wandered into the bathroom. He gazed at himself in the mirror while he rubbed her blood all over his face and hands. Before leaving, if he hadn't desecrated her body enough, he forced animal feces into her mouth. Just an absolute heinous, monstrous, and vile human. Around 6 p.m. that day, Teresa's husband, David, would enter the home. He felt a dark feeling and could tell that something was very, very wrong. He walked through his home and entered the bedroom and came upon the scene that is one that still haunted David for decades to come. On January 27th, 1978, 38-year-old Evelyn Moroth was enjoying some time in her home, a place you should feel safe and secure. She was babysitting her 20-month-old nephew David that day and had invited her friend, 51-year-old Dan Meredith, over to spend some time with her. Her son, 6-year-old Jason, was getting ready to walk to a friend's house, but before he could leave, Richard Trenton Chase would check to see if their door was unlocked, and since it was, he let himself in. He shot Dan in the head before seeing the child Jason, and shot him as well, before finding Evelyn in the bathtub. He surprised her there and shot her before dragging her out into the bedroom. There, he sodomized her, cut her open, and like Teresa, disemboweled her. He even tried to cut her eyes out. Again, there seemed to be tracings in blood on the floor in a bucket-like shape, indicating that he had harvested her blood, some organs, or even both. And as for the baby, the things that Richard did to this infant are so disturbing. So I'll spare some of the details, but I'll say that after killing and beginning to empty the child's head of their brains, a knock came to the door and distracted Richard. He fled the scene and took the baby's tiny body. See, the child, Jason's friend, was worried when Jason hadn't arrived for their play date. So the little girl went over to knock on the door, and this is the knock that scared Richard, and he fled the scene with the baby and the body, parts of which he would later consume. Later, neighbors would begin to talk. It wasn't like Jason did not show up for a play date or his mother to ignore a knock at the door. And it was a neighbor who first entered the home to see the grisly scene. And I really don't know if I've ever heard a more gruesome act being committed against a child. And this is the part of true crime that's always difficult for me to get through. And I almost didn't cover this case because of the sheer disgust and pain I feel talking about it. And honestly, I'm dreading having to edit this video and listen to it all again. But I wanted to bring you this story because I think the lesson here at the end is so, so vitally important. And thankfully, this would be Richard's final murder. And the way he was caught was nothing short of serendipitous. The FBI had been brought in to help solve the case, which I think was a great move on local authorities' part. Sometimes local authorities can get in their ego and not ask for help to solve a case like this, and it's great that the local police were able to recognize how utterly severe this case was and how it needed to be solved as quickly as possible. So they instantly began questioning the community and put out a police sketch of the murderer and what they thought he would have looked like. I mean, can you imagine living in that neighborhood knowing that someone was out there just waiting for you to let your guard down enough to break into your home so they could do these atrocious things to you? It would be absolutely horrifying. One day, a woman named Nancy Holden was shopping when an odd man approached her as if he knew her. He asked her if she was on the motorcycle when Kurt got killed, and she was just utterly confused. Because she had dated a boy named Kurt who had sadly died on a motorcycle, but she had no idea who this stranger was. So she asked him what his name was, and he replied Rick Chase. Richard had gone by Rick in high school. He was clean cut and put together back then, nothing like this disheveled and dirty man that stood before her. Red flags just started swirling around her, and Nancy instantly knew that she had to get away from this man. But Richard followed her out of the store and to her car, intent on getting a ride from her. But luckily, she was able to get into her car, lock the door, and prevent him from getting in. And thank God she did, because who would have known what would have happened to her if she hadn't escaped this monster? Also, she'd seen the police sketch of the suspect and knew all about the murders, so after that encounter, she knew that there was a very big possibility that Rick from high school was actually Richard, the vampire murderer. Nancy tipped off the police, and they finally had a name to run through their database. After seeing Richard's criminal record and his history of institution, they were able to attain his address and go confront him. They knocked on the door, demanding him to answer, but he refused. Now, the cops pretended to leave the area, and when Richard thought it was safe, he took the bait, and he saw this as his opportunity to dispose of some evidence. He put some blood-stained towels and papers in a box, and he opened the door to go get rid of the evidence. But when he opened that door, he was apprehended by police and taken into custody, while other officers stayed behind and searched the apartment. The apartment smelled like nothing they had smelled before. It was putrid, disgusting, and everything was covered in blood. Even the cups and the silverware in the kitchen were covered with red stains with blood all over them. They found remnants of dead animals and humans in the apartment, including bones and brain tissue. He had a blender, and it was stained as if it had been used to make another disgusting bloody cocktail. Only this time, most likely he was using human organs. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, officers would also find a calendar. On the dates of the murders, Richard had written the word today, and throughout the year had written the same word 44 times on 44 more days. It would have brought the death toll to 50 that year if he hadn't been apprehended. The trial began in 1979. Richard was charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. Although his defense tried to use his insanity as reasoning for what had happened in an effort to reduce his sentence, the jury still found Richard guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to die in a gas chamber in San Quentin Penitentiary. After a series of troubling interviews where he claimed that he was forced to kill these people by Nazi UFOs if he wanted to live, he ended up taking his own life. He hoarded his medication and took them all in one large gulp. He was found dead in his cell on December 26, 1980. This is a story that doesn't even feel real. Even after all the research I did, I still cannot believe it happened, and it's so extreme and gruesome, terrifying, horrific that I don't even think that my brain or my nervous system wants to accept that things like this can happen, or even accept that there are people out there capable of doing things like this. My heart and everything in me feels for the victims and their loved ones. I cannot imagine the trauma that must haunt them after knowing or even seeing what this monster did to the people that they love. Words truly can't describe how awful those acts were. And I think honestly, we're all going to need some time to recover after hearing this story. I mean, I know I'm going to need some time. If there's anything I can implore my viewers to do after watching this, it's to please lock your doors. Even if you're home, I mean, especially if you're home, lock your doors. We now have more security, more technology, so please make sure to make the investment and protect yourself. And just honestly, never even open the door for anyone you aren't expecting. Your home is where you should feel the most safe and the most secure. So please take steps to protect yourself, even if you trust your neighbors and your community. You just never know who might be wandering around out there. Thank you for going on this journey with me. I know it was a difficult one to get through, and please let me know your thoughts down below. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Please, please stay safe out there. And until next time, goodbye.